Hello again to the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today we have kind of a panel and an interesting discussion on a book. Now we're not Donald. This is not we're not one-time hosts, perennial one-time hosts. He usually does the book club stuff, but we were all kind of captivated by this one book, an old book written in the late 1800s in Russia. Can you guess what it is? It's maybe three or four famous books from that time. Anyway, we're going to talk about Anna Karenina from Leo Tolstoy today. We're all captivated by it. And the we here is Evan, Gigi, Going Godward, and Nate. All have been on the podcast before, hosting or as guests. Do you all want to introduce yourselves just for old time's sake?
Sure.
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 Nate, why don't you start?
I'm Nate, Tornado Nate, and I do a lot of the ag stuff and sometimes talk about trout.
Yes. Gigi?
I'm Going Godward on Twitter, not my given name. I tweet a lot about therapy stuff, relationship philosophy, theology, that type of thing. And I don't know how many times I've done Doom Optimism stuff, a few times, but I'm excited to talk about this book that really is kind of riveting.
All right, and Evan, I am Python Rock Snake on Twitter, and yeah, aspiring homesteader, sort of making that in the process of that transition right now, and well, that has some themes related to Anna Karenina, and this is one of I was joking, I was talking before we started recording on. Just thinking like, oh, I read this like 2 years ago, and then I was thinking like actually remembering the years. I was like, yeah, it was maybe like 5 years ago. So
Yeah.
life comes at you fast. But yeah, hugely influential book, and I one of my favorites, and yeah, excited to talk about it.
Nice. So I recently, part of what gave me the idea to do this is I recently, Gigi, saw you tweeting about reading it, and I had gotten by when I saw that your tweets about it, I had gotten like maybe a third of the way through, and then I decided, hey, I should like pick that up again. But I actually ended up starting over because it had been a few years, and I just read it all the way through, and I was really captivated by it. And then Nate, you started reading it with your son. Did you finish it? And did you read it at the same pace as your son?
We did. We finished it about the same time, and he was gonna come on, and I like you had mentioned having him on. And I was like, that's great. I want him to do something like that, but he just broke his collarbone last week and had surgery a few days ago, and not doesn't want to make his first podcast appearance while kind of still in the sea of tramadol.
Yeah. So maybe we can start by, your kind of big picture, kind of, you know, sense of the book, what you got out of it, and maybe how it themes that relate to conversations we have on Dio. So yeah, maybe Evan, do you want to start?
Sure. For me, like it's hard to pick an exact theme or from the big picture. One of the things that impresses me so much about Tolstoy as a writer is it it's I'm so thoroughly impressed by his ability to love his characters, and that just shines through every single person he writes. And he writes some terrible people who make really bad choices. And it's funny. I was talking. I kind of read it back to back with my wife, which is always fun. I highly recommend this. It's like the most exclusive book club in the world to read books at the same time as your spouse. Um, but she had read it as a teenager and had been a little bit mixed on it, and was just kind of like, all these people are dumb. They're stupid. Like they make bad choices. Like, what's this about? Everybody's just dumb. And then she reread it as an adult, and she was like, they're dumb, and I love them because they're dumb, and I'm dumb, and we're all dumb. And it was just, that kind of revelation of you recognize in the choices these people make, like the same patterns that we all have in our thoughts, in our relationships, in our choices. And you recognize even when these terrible people are making terrible choices, you're like, I that could have been me. Like I can imagine myself, you know, constrained by events and making a terrible choice, and facing these terrible consequences for it. And so just the humanity of it, and just the deep humanism of it, I think is something that shines through really from start to finish, and that's something that makes that I just it makes such an impression on me because I can't there's a few other authors I think that come close, and I'd love to talk about them, but that's such a treasure in the world of literature.
Mm, nice. Gigi, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think maybe this is what I said in a tweet. I just was so struck by how Tolstoy really understood the human condition. He really understood how people feel in these little nuanced ways when they're experiencing something tragic or when they're experiencing love or joy or they're faced with death or things like that. He just so understands what we go through, all those little thoughts and feelings. He's just so nuanced in his character development. In terms of like Levin, his character particularly, he was one of my favorite characters in the book. And there's one particular instance where Kitty is thinking about marrying him, and she's thinking about his faith, and he says, he doesn't really believe in God and that kind of thing. And what Kitty remarks on is that he says he doesn't believe, and I guess wouldn't call himself a religious or Christian person or whatever, but Kitty talks kind of about the orientation of his heart, and that even if he says he's not, she sees in him a life of integrity and honesty and compassion and that kind of thing. And I just think Tolstoy wrote his character as kind of a model. I really think he's just a really great man. I know that he has flaws, and there are things that maybe he that paints him sometimes in a pleasant light. But I think overall he's a good man, and um, his concern, particularly for the underclass, I guess, for peasants, for that working class, I think speaks to a lot of people who are maybe in the DO audience. So yeah, those were just some things that stuck out to me in the book.
Nate?
Yeah, I was actually under the impression that this was the seed of a Konstantin Levin fan group.
Mm.
I thought that's what this was. Yeah, obviously that guy, I love that character so much. And so Evan, like you mentioned, kind of reading this with your wife and having a great experience. Reading it with my 15-year-old son was incredible. Like we kind of kept pace with each other, and we were both yeah, completely head over heels for it. We're like, this is amazing. And so, and we every night we were talking about the book, and it was just a load of fun. And as we were reading it, he was, as I was, I mean, just so struck by that particular character. And I was really grateful for it at this time to kind of like, I felt like this is awesome. This is like a perfect role model right now for my 15-year-old who's like, absorbing literature and reading this. I'm like, yeah, like go ahead, gravitate towards this character. That's a very, good thing. And yeah, and additionally, Evan, like you mentioned too, just the compassion he writes for his characters, even, the title character, who is sometimes very, very difficult to, yeah, like he is so caring and careful about how he discusses all of them. So it's just an incredible book in that way, and captures literal, birth and death, and his birth and death scenes are so potent. And I think one of the things, I guess, a theme that I would name, there's a number of them, and obviously they're mostly related to Levin's storyline, I think, per Doomer Optimism specifically. Pardon?
Oh,
Oh,
sorry, it's my kid. I thought I was muted.
But they concern Levin's storyline specifically, and I'll just throw out that one of the things I really appreciated over the course of the book, you could see, I mean, Levin's great, but he's also sort of really frustrating at times, right? Because he just gets into these mental, tizzies, and he'll just think himself into like these wild places, and so you can get really frustrated with him at times. And we go through a lot of those cycles in the book with him, and you can see the things that wind him up, like trying to interface and deal with society, and just some of the, I think, what Tolstoy probably thinks were some insane aspects of Russian society, and you'd see Levin encounter those, and you'd see him get really wound up and tight. And it was always when he would get back to being on the land, or he would spend time with peasants. Like there was like very specifically, and he told in great detail the things that brought Levin back to his senses. And I use that term very intentionally. They brought him back to his senses. And and it's really beautiful how he did that. Like he would tell, and Levin would spin, and then he'd bring him back. And every time he brought him back, it was, like I said, something to do with the land, something to do with his direct relationship with Kitty, not his ideas about that, but when he was in contact with her, when he was, interacting with, with the peasant people that he was surrounded by. These are things that sort of brought him to his senses, and I thought that was really interesting and intentional, and just to kind of see that, and then culminate, I think, with his um, description of his sort of at the end of the book, I think kind of culminated with that, and you kind of got a sense of his journey and what it is that brought him closer to that sort of peace of mind he found at the end.
No, my kid is not happy that I have the door closed, and so I'm a little frazzled. But yeah, I feel a little bit like Levin or Anna Karenina at the end of the book. Not quite that bad. Uh, I mean, yeah, I mean in general, it's about the characters. It's about the internal lives of the characters and getting absorbed into certain internal lives, and then seeing them interact with other characters. Like there's a few characters that maybe interact once or twice in the book, and you're like so bought into each character, but then you're seeing their worlds collide. I'm thinking maybe, for example, like the main characters, like when Levin and Vronsky, or when Levin and Anna Karenina meet or something. It's like, it's just like what's going on. Like like these two things shouldn't mix. But one thing, I guess, overall theme of the book that really stuck out to me was the kind of symmetry between Vronsky and Kitty's relationship. I mean, sorry, Vronsky and Anna's relationship, and Levin and Kitty's relationship. Like, when one set is like hot, the other one's cold. Um, there's an obvious symmetry, which we can get into near the end, where the internal life of Anna is like hellish. It feels like literal hell. Like it's hard to read. It's hard to read that last chapter of Anna, and just how she's viewing the world and how negative she's seeing everything, and everything is just horrible and an attack on her. And then you see the last scene with Levin, where he's having this kind of religious conversion, and everything is beautiful. There's problems, but it's all part of like this idea of the good, this transcendent idea of the good. And that contrast is probably my favorite part of the book, of you know Anna's final scene and Levin's final scene. I just think it's brilliant. I think that was very intentional, like both the symmetry of the two sets of relationships, but also I would say those are the two main characters, and the symmetry there, and kind of like really like hell and heaven, right? Like kind of reaching their kind of endpoint on Earth. And yeah.
That's something that really has really struck me about it in comparison to other pieces of literature is particularly that character of Anna and her um sort of the almost the fatalism of it. It's very so I love to compare this book to another one of my favorites, which is kind of right on the same level in my estimation, which is Kristin Lavransdatter by Sigrid Undset, which is a 20th century Norwegian novel. And I don't actually have confirmation, but I would be extremely surprised if Undset was not aware of had not read this and was not aware of it and was not in some dimension responding to it. Um, but it's interesting the contrast there of the title characters, because with Anna you have the situation where she's making these choices, she's making these decisions, and everything at the same time, everything feels like it's hard to imagine her making a different choice because of who she is. It's sort of the classical Greek idea of fate, where your fate is really bound up in who you are, and your tragic flaw is it's your own character, and there's not another choice you could have made and still been you. And that's just striking all the way through Anna Karenina. She makes these terrible choices, but at the same time, you kind of understand how she had to make them because of who she is, and then suffer the consequences as a result. Which is just, it's interesting to see that contrast versus, so Kristen in this other book is a very, in some ways, a similar character, similar titular character of, that all this drama revolves around, but there the situations are set up completely differently, where it's like you can imagine her making a different choice in every situation, and every some one of the choices she makes is, she's the agent. She's presented with these kind of 50-50, branching paths, and you see her following the one that she does follow, but you can imagine her going the other way. And so it's a really interesting, to me, reflection on how, how we go through life, how we make our choices, and how much of that is bound up in who we are and how much is bound up in, the circumstances that are presented to us. And yeah, to me, that question, and that's really an overarching question all the way through, is like, how much are you an agent, how much are you in control, how much are your choices shaping your destiny?
Hmm.
um,
Here, I'm curious, Gigi. Um, you're the only woman on the panel. How much do you sympathize with Anna Karenina? Like, do you see it? Oh, she's just being dumb. She's making bad choices. Uh, she's looking at it wrong, or do you kind of sympathize? Like, yeah, I kind of see where she's coming from. Like, I kind of see why she did that. I'm curious your perspective there.
I mean, honestly,
Mhm.
I feel like Evan's given like such a great like intellectual perspective. I'm gonna be like, I thought that I was so frustrated with her so much of the book. I was just like, okay, girl, you need to just have some integrity. You need to just cool your jets. You don't need to be with this Vronsky guy. He's a skeevy guy. I was very frustrated with her. I mean, I understand. I mean, anybody who knows me, I mean, I understand the female condition. I understand the female impulse. I know um, what women long for and what they need, and when those things are not being met, they get squirrely and they do dumb stuff and make bad decisions. But I felt like her husband. I understand that she felt emotionally disconnected from him, and he was not there meeting those needs. I guess though, in her instance, I just thought that she made a lot of bad choices, and I think that like, I always thought of her husband, even though he was emotionally, removed or disconnected or whatever, he always was looking out for her honor. Like, he always wanted for her to maintain her honor, and I mean, some of that I'm sure was, like, to protect his own as well. I mean, I'm sure some of it was his own pride and wanting to protect himself, but I was mostly frustrated with her. I have compassion on her as a woman and just and what she was facing and that feeling of being emotionally disconnected from the man she's married to, but I also feel like she made a lot of bad choices and did not have any integrity whatsoever. I thought whenever she was very sick and thought she was dying, I thought this was going to be her redeeming moment, and she was going to, she was going to be okay, and she and her husband were going to be together, and she was going to let him love her in the ways that he could, but ultimately that is not what happened. So I do have compassion on her in some ways and on their marriage. But I really wish that she um, had let her husband protect her honor and had stayed in that situation. Maybe I'm wrong for thinking that, but that was my thought.
Hmm.
Well, I certainly can't imagine that that's wrong. Like, that's certainly a certain aspect. You look at it and it's like objectively right. Like, like stop doing what you're doing. It's going to end badly. Like, you know, like that's what happened. So it's like she should have, at many points, done differently. But I really relate to what Evan said. I feel like there was weakness and getting swept away at the beginning, and then afterwards it was just sort of like you're just seeing it like a tractor beam pulling her in, and there's no chance that she could make a different decision. Like, and then the question of agency is really a good one there too, because I also think that a lot of that was to do with the social circumstances at the time. So a confluence of the social circumstances at the time, her own decision, like those things you could just see. It's like this is like a slow motion disaster. And I think there was the one opportunity, after the birth, there, I feel like that was the only opportunity in the whole entire book after she and Vronsky like fell over the edge.
Mm.
Was that moment, and you could also see why that couldn't happen either. But like I felt like there was a chance there, and other than that, I just did like at no point did I see there even as a chance of making a different decision, like not even a bit. And the most frustrated I was with her character in the entire book was early when, and this was an interesting thing to compare with the other storyline, was when she just was completely lied to her husband, and really was like basically in modern terminology like gaslighting him, like I don't know what you're talking about, this is completely, and just like she put up the wall, and she was lying to herself and fooling herself at the same time she was lying to her husband, and her husband knew it, right, but also had this idea of like, well, jealousy is unbecoming, even though jealousy was actually at that point an extremely appropriate response. And jealousy was also something that Levin struggled with, to his own flaw. Levin struggled with jealousy and was jealous, and wrestled with jealousy, but he brought his jealousy to Kitty and they worked through his jealousy. Whereas Alexei refused to acknowledge the jealousy and then allowed something to continue to happen because he wouldn't connect with her. So jealousy, this thing that we generally kind of uniformly view, like most people, like as a bad thing, it presents like Levin being kind of a jealous person, but then also working through that in relationship. And I thought that was the jealousy contrast was super, super fascinating to me.
Yeah, I wanted to going back a little bit to like the notion of agency. I feel like there was one other moment where like there was in the scene right when she was about to throw herself in front of the train. Sorry, spoiler alert. The book's been around a long time. No excuses. Read the book anyway. But the moment she was about to throw herself in front of the train, there was a passage, I don't remember exactly, but where she had a second thought, where she thought, I forget how it was put, but do you all remember that? Where like she had this thought of like some kind of light or some kind of, sanity, clarity coming through. And then she was like, nah. And then she was like, she jumped in. And that feels like a moment of, if most of the book, if Nate's right, where, it was just kind of this inexorable process, maybe there were a few points where you could say there was free will and there was a choice that was made that didn't have to be made given the circumstances. I don't know if you all remember that part of the book or not, but yeah, notion of jealousy. I was trying to think of. There was also the scene where, and this kind of ties the two plot lines together a little bit, where Anna Karenina kind of tries to seduce Levin, right, or at least really attract him. And of course, when he feels guilty about it because he's very attracted to her, and then he brings it to Kitty, and then she's jealous. And I don't know what that's, that might be apropos of nothing, but maybe I don't know. I'm curious to explore more. Like, are these two different books? Like these two different storylines? Are these two different books? Should they be two different books, or what makes the whole book a cohesive whole? Besides the brief interactions between, the two main sets of characters.
I guess I'd say, for me it's that contrast between them, and that's the overarching theme, I guess, is really, that compare and contrast of two in some dimension similar personalities, um, you know, ex kind of going through that and developing in different directions. So you see Levin struggling with, some of these negative impulses. You see him struggling with the jealousy, um, but he has a, and I guess that's the interesting question, is what is the difference? That he has the outlet to to turn that towards growth and, towards a healthy relationship with Kitty, and not towards the kind of isolating narcissism that that Anna really spirals into. And that's I yeah, I guess I don't really know what the difference is, but I see that as kind of the core theme of the book is that contrast between them.
Yeah, yeah, I agree.
Well, I think like I was saying earlier about Levin's heart orientation. I mean, I think from the very beginning, you see Anna as having a certain orientation, like in terms of like posture of her heart. I mean, it is kind of like you're saying, it's a little narcissistic. It's kind of turned inward, and Levin is always turned outward. I feel like he's always looking around, thinking about the world around him, and not so much focusing on his. I mean, he does of course have an internal dialogue and that kind of thing, but his focus is just so different. His heart orientation is so different, and I just think you have these two kind of opposing characters, um, in terms of I guess
But
just, who they are in their hearts really.
well, and you certainly see that to the earlier point, you see that of his grounding the in nature, in agriculture, in the village life, in cutting hay with the peasants, and that Tolstoy very clearly wants to emphasize that as that kind of grounding is essential to his character and his being able to find a path forward through his challenges.
Do you think this book is a partially a critique of, like there's a lot of discussion now about kind of agrarian sensibility and a cosmopolitan sensibility or an urban sensibility. Um, in many ways, it feels like this book could have been written now, but just with slightly different, you know, slightly different context and factors and things. But the underlying themes are very alive now. Do you see him like, and Nate, you kind of emphasize this a lot, that you see this as like a very core agrarian book.
Mhm.
And do you feel that way about kind of the stuff with Levin, or do you feel that about the whole book? Like, are the scenes in St. Petersburg and Moscow also, coming from an agrarian sensibility?
Yes, 100%. I think that was it's an agrarian it is just a deeply agrarian book in my opinion. And from the very start, when before he's even gone and seen Kitty at the ice rink, and he's visiting with Stepan Arkadyevich, who, by the way, what a freaking airhead is that guy. That guy is just the most clueless, like,
Oblonsky. We have
yeah,
to talk about
Oblonsky,
Oblonsky.
that guy, oh my god. Anyway, but from that very first scene where he's just essentially like, I don't know how you live with this. Like, he has just this no capacity for this uh uh oh, I can't think of the word. This life that, this kind of fake false, I think he would call it. And that theme, continues to develop. So I think a lot of Levin's agrarianism, which he I mean, Tolstoy in great detail,
Mm,
paints viscerally and beautifully. Gosh, he's a writer. And just like these scenes, these living scenes of the earth, of the peasantry, of the work, of the land. Um, the contrast of that with the life of society is
mm.
just I mean, there's just no way that, like, that's, to me, that's the point, is contrasting, like, this sort of
High society, I would add that.
yeah, right, yes. And just how out of touch,
Mm,
right, and how completely divorced from human needs and human values, and how something like what happened, with Anna and Vronsky, like that, the roots of that are in the soil of this, high society of Russia at that time, and that is explicitly contrasted with, the virtues, I think he would say, that one develops when living, close to the land, and in communion with the land,
mm,
and people, not in this, even the scenes between, I can't remember her name, but his main, housekeeper, I can't remember the woman's name, who is a really neat character.
mm.
You know, the there's something in the interactions in those environments that's just fundamentally different than the interactions that people have. And Oblonsky's actually a really great, like he's just a completely vapid person. Um, and I feel like it's typical, like he's the typical person in that environment. And so I think that contrast is extremely explicit, and it's pretty subversive because that's not the point. Like the point is, this. That's why he ends the book on Levin's story. Like he ends there, right? Because that's the point. That storyline is the point, in my opinion.
Let me just ask you this, Nate. He does marry Kitty, and Kitty is kind of also representative of high society, right? She comes from that, and they form a union, and he brings her family to his place. He has a good relationship with her father. Father's a prince, definitely part of that society as well. Like I agree with you that he's definitely leaning. He has, he's kind of using Anna to represent the, the kind of corruption of high society, um, high urbanism, I guess, and then Levin to represent the virtues of agrarianism. But there's also a bridge there as well in that marriage, I
Mhm.
would say. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, I'm interested in what you guys see. What pops into my mind, I think, is that the part of that bridge is something about tradition, I think, because there's something in that high society that feels very new, right? Because he kind of talks about like the prince, Kitty and Dolly's father. That's a person that Tolstoy seems to hold in high esteem. Like he's held up like he represents some virtue, I think. And he's much more anchored in a tradition, I think. And it's like I think that the society that he's criticizing seems to me to be one that has become sort of unmoored from something that's there was a tradition before it that it has drifted from, right? And that tradition includes marriage for sure. And so so there's something in that high society that's sort of gone astray, right? But there's like a deeper way that tradition and society have conducted itself over time. So it's not just like society generally, it's that particular time and the way that it started to become unmoored, which, for me, I'm like, that seems like a thing of industrialism, but maybe that's just my all criticism of everything. So I don't know.
Hmm.
Well, to me, there's a really interesting contrast there when you speak about the kind of the tradition and the community and the rootedness of it. So two of my very favorite scenes, and there's such an interesting contrast. So there's the chapters where Anna and Vronsky go to Italy, and they are in this beautiful natural setting in the Italian lakes, and they're taking art classes, and they're learning to paint the landscapes. And it's so beautifully written, and they're because it's so painful because they're bad because like it's not even that they're not skilled, but they just can't quite commit to it. And they're like the description of it, of just like, I mean, you know these people, you've met these people, you've experienced it's like you've seen people go through this, of like they're going to take up a hobby and they're just you know
It's
and
so brilliant. It's so brilliant. I'm sorry, but it's just like perfect. Of course, Bronsky's going to be an artist. Of course
right.
he is. Of
Right.
course.
Yeah, it's just perfect. I love it. I mean, it's painful to read because it's just because it's so spot on. And then the scene that I love, that the contrast to that is on Levin's farm, they go on a mushroom hunt because they want to set up, and I forget exactly the characters. It's somebody's brother-in-law that they want to set up with
Mm,
one of the other young ladies, and they're going to set these two up, and the contrivance that they have is everybody's going to go on a mushroom hunt through the woods and pick mushrooms, and they're going to get them to bump into each other, and they're going to fall in love. And what I love about it is that it doesn't work, and
Mhm.
it's a failure, and it doesn't really matter, and the chapter is still beautiful, and everybody, like it's a little bit of a disappointment, but it's not a tragedy because they're in, and just that contrast of like they're in the right place, they're where they belong, they're doing a good thing. It doesn't really matter that their plans didn't come together. and just the difference of that between, versus the scheme to go to Italy and become artists is such an incredible contrast to me.
That was another little dig I thought at to like his brother-in-law. I forget his name, but the character you're talking about, who was in the woods and the real intellectual one. And to me, that
Hmm.
was that whole little scene
Or I
was just
guess
kind of
it's his half brother, not his
half
brother-in-law.
brother. Yeah,
Yep.
half brother. That's right.
And the
Um,
woman that they're trying to set up, she is like a hero to Kitty, right?
yeah,
Because she
Hmm.
was like always raised in service and kind of gave Kitty this kind of religious revelation at the time. And so there was also this interesting contrast there that almost worked, and they both those characters wanted it to work, but they just couldn't
yeah.
actually do it. Yeah.
And it's because his half brother was that was the dig. I think intellectualism really is like you just can't get out of your head. You're just such a heady person that you can't allow yourself to make that leap. So I thought that was there are like all these digs throughout the book because it's so long and there's so many different scenes, and that was intellectualism. I think was something he kind of kicked whenever he could, and that was a good chance for him to do that.
Nate, there was kind of one thread throughout the book that always reminded me of you, and it was uh, when like Levin's brother-in-law would like try to convince Levin that he should care about these like larger scale societal things about like national education, and Levin was always like, well, but it doesn't connect with me. I know that maybe I'm a bad person for not wanting to take on these large responsibilities, but it's not like rooted in who I am or what I want. And that actually reminds me of what you said, Gigi, of how he's always looking outward, but he wasn't always looking outward of like, reading the newspaper about world events. It was outward in front of him. It was not outward in an abstract way. It was abstract, but it was rooted in what he was very much engaged in. So either of you want to pick up on that?
I don't know if this is gonna speak to what you're saying, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that piece where the education piece where he was reluctant to encourage the people who work for him to like have access to like education, like make education compulsory. And there was kind of the point where I don't remember who it was he was in conversation with, but they were just talking about like, well, then they'll be able to see a life that they could have if they had this education, and they can see a life that they could have. He goes, yeah, see it and not be able to attain it. Like, what good is it for them to learn about a life that they can never have or aspire to? I mean, they're just going to learn about it and be bitter that they can't have that life. And so I just thought his perspective on like compulsory education, like they were doing in other parts of Europe, were was really interesting. And Levin was kind of opposed to that, and he gave his reasons why. And I just thought that was a really interesting little piece about education.
Yeah, and that was all like a piece with what you described, Jason, and there was a scene later in the book I think that tied into that, which I felt I was just delighted by because I feel like it was near the end of the book and I was just enraptured with it. And then there was a scene to me out of nowhere where they're talking about the war, I think wherever it was, Serbia or Kosovo, I don't remember. Uh, and he just goes on to talk about his perspective on war, which is basically like, I don't know, it's not here. Why, why are we like it just again my perspective almost completely on a lot of these issues that it's like we're taking he refuses or doesn't understand like why I should care and take responsibility for problems that I can't really do anything about, and that I'm likely to, by trying to do something about it, make bigger problems and make worse. My life is here, my surroundings are here, the things I can influence are here, my heart is here. Why are you telling me I'm supposed to care about these things a half a world away, or these issues that are not present in our like the people like we had like he was just really resistant to these invasive ideas that he felt were going to uh, change and corrupt either like his immediate surroundings or like send people And I thought it was interesting too, the people he described as going to that war too, and like they, being valorized and heroized, and maybe that was not so much the case. I just really enjoyed his treatment of the war. I'm like, you just stuck that in. I felt like you stuck that in just for me. Thanks, Leo.
I
Yeah.
missed a little tidbit back when you were talking about the agrarian theme of the book. When I immediately Levin's character, I think Nate said this too, like Levin's character, in my opinion, because of how he modeled that character, who he made him be, like he kind of made him the star of the show in a way, just his life, and he was the agrarian. I think that Tolstoy is definitely a localist agrarian. I think he's pro localism, pro agrarianism, and so I think this book is so good for the doomer optimism crowd. I think it affirms what we all believe, and where like our attention should be focused. I don't know that. Just want to add a little tidbit.
Yeah. This might be getting kind of geeky, but I kind of want to talk about the book he was trying to write and like what he was trying to figure out about agriculture.
Yeah.
And it seemed like I was having a little bit of trouble, like because he was confused himself after he, kind of a little bit later in the book where he's kind of coming to this conclusion. Like he tries, for example, okay, like let me have a relationship with the peasants where instead of you know me being the landlord and then working, they're like co-owners or something. Like he's flirting with some kind of cooperative model, um, and but he never, but the peasants themselves are skeptical of it, right? Because they're not sure what this is. It's different. They're not, it might be too risky for them to not like um, feel like they're just getting a wage or something. um, yeah, I'm curious what you all thought about this book he was trying to write, and what was the fundamental question he was trying to answer.
Well, yeah, I definitely had thoughts about that. I thought that was a super interesting subplot as well. Especially I think if you put it in context of just that like 60 years, not that I'm an expert on this at all, but like that's basically 50, 60 years of Russian history, which went from, like freeing the serfs basically, which so it seems to me, and again, I don't know that much about Russian history, but it seems clear from the book and what little I do know that this took place in a period of pretty rapid social change, like different leadership, relationship to the czar, land reform. It seems like it happened. The serfs had been freed, so there was a peasant class, but they didn't really know what to do with themselves. It didn't seem like very well. Like it was like still people used to kind of being serfs, and so there was this period of change, and then fast forward a number of years, and then you have the revolution,
Yeah.
which would lead to the people who did whatever they did figure out. The people who figured that out would then later be killed or sent away, in the purge of the kulaks. So it's sort of a really interesting period to look at this. It's like this interim where they're trying to figure out like how does this relationship to the land work, and how labor, and who owns the labor. And you had and it was sort of like you have the essentially the failure of um a peasantry in a really way to develop into a peasantry. It seems like that's sort of what was happening. Is there was like a reluctance. There were a few models. There was the one peasant farmer I think he interacted with that seemed to have kind of started to figure that out.
Right.
But
That one very successful peasant was
yeah,
was probably becoming a kulak who would then be
yes,
purged later on. Right.
right. He figured it out. Like he was doing it. He was the person who would have been like, yeah, like this is a good model for how you can work the land and have.
Mhm.
But oops, they went a different direction.
Right. Well, I like
Um,
to speculate that if Levin, in an alternative timeline, if Levin had been successful in like writing his book, figuring it out, and those reforms actually being influential, maybe the Bolshevik Revolution would have been avoided.
right. Yeah. Yeah. Or
Right.
because,
Like if
and I
they
think,
adopted some kind of more cooperative model where, but small scale, not into, technology for technology's sake, but what's appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. um, the impetus towards the Bolshevik Revolution, the popular support wouldn't have been there.
Yeah.
That's just my speculation.
Yeah, and I think that that's sort of like the question that you're asking. I think is the same one that we're still pondering. It's been a lot of time, like on the podcast and our discussions that we have of like, well, what is the relationship between a land and a people, and how do you organize that, and how does technology fit into that, and whose responsibility, who's the decision maker, who's responsible, like basically all the questions we're still asking are ones that I think that was the topic of Levin's book was, how do we organize ourselves on the land? Who owns it? And that's something that Tolstoy himself, I think, really, obviously he thought about it in the book, but at the end of his life, he wanted to give away his, I forget the name of it, but his estate. His wife was like, hell no, you're not going to do that. But he wanted to give it away because he didn't believe in ownership anymore. Like that's what. So I think he's, through his character of Levin, is sort of struggling with this. What's an ownership model for the land? How do you live on it? Who owns the land? Who's responsible for the land?
Evan, do you have any thoughts about like Levin's book and what he was trying to get at?
You know, I yeah, I don't know that I have much to add to what Nate said there. I think, it's an interesting question, as far as the book within a book, like what vision did Levin have? And also, for the purpose of Levin's character, like how much is the book a foil for what he eventually ends up figuring out, and maybe the book is a stand-in for this kind of over intellectualized way of analyzing the world, and maybe the answer that Tolstoy gives is, hey, stop thinking about it so much, just go work the land. And the answer, and maybe there isn't an answer, maybe that's just you do the work that's presented before you. That's, I guess that's kind of how I would approach it. um,
Nice. Um, let's see
The
what other.
problem the problem being with that, like, I think, and again, I think that this seems like something Tolstoy struggled with his whole life until he died, was, and it takes a really ominous, like, there's the ominous overshadowing of that we all know what happened next, right? So
right.
it's like Levin needed to actually be thinking about it. It's like, no, don't just, like, because if you don't think about it, like, there's this horrendous thing coming down the pike that if you
Right.
don't solve this problem, it's going to, and it does, and he
Right.
doesn't. So it's kind of like, yeah, don't think about
Of
it, but
course,
then at the same
Tolstoy
time,
also didn't know that this was coming down the pike.
exactly,
Right.
exactly. So
Maybe
it's
if
like
he
this thing
did,
Although,
that
I
we
mean,
know.
he would have
he
answered that
seems to
question
have had
first.
some inklings. I mean, he knew something was coming. I mean,
Yeah.
he certainly, his other writings, like he was certainly well aware of the unsustainability of the situation that he was observing. I
Hmm.
mean, and that's very clear. I mean, he certainly, I mean, I don't think he had, prophetic view of what was exactly how it was going to come, but I think there's no question he knew that Russian society was sitting on a volcano.
So are we replaying that history now in the United States? And again, it's like, different circumstance, but we all kind of have a sense that the status quo is unsustainable for a variety of reasons. It could go down a very dark path unless we figure out something out that's very fundamental. Is this like a cautionary tale for like, okay, Levin couldn't figure it out, obviously. Of course, he's not a real character, he's a fictional character, but if there was a real life Levin, he didn't figure it out. Um, are we going to
I think real life Levin was Leo Tolstoy, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah.
probably, probably. So what's that cautionary tale of like, what do we have to figure out that Tolstoy did not figure out to prevent, a similar kind of fate?
I
Like,
guess I'm the one who my bio says 85% optimist. So, I I certainly don't think we are in anywhere near as volatile of a situation in terms of, people having a large mass of people who are disenfranchised, politically and economically on anything like the same sort of scale, um, of Russia in Tolstoy's day. At the same time, I think there's, perhaps something that we see there. I think really the example that is probably more relevant to all of our lives is is Anna and her circle and the lives of the high society of the cosmopolitans and their sort of self-destructive ennui of, they don't, I love the comic. It's a web comic from Webcomic Name, and it's just called Different. And it's the guy who says, I wish things would be different. And the second panel, he's smashing everything up in his room.
Mm.
And the third panel is him just looking at all the smashed stuff saying, oh no. And it's so perfect because there is this impulse of, we have our lives are so orderly, and we chafe against that. And I think you can certainly read that into Anna's story of her self-destructive tendencies coming out of just a refusal to be content with what is objectively a pretty decent situation. Um, and yeah, so yeah, I think I think that side of the story is really the more relevant one to our day and age.
Mm.
What's really interesting real quick, what's really interesting in that is that leading up to the affair, right? He did not spend much time. He did not paint Anna as like like a deeply unhappy person. Like she didn't seem like she was miserable in her marriage. Like it didn't like he didn't go into that at all. It didn't sound like it was all after the affair, and you never could tell if she just retroactively decided that her marriage was terrible because she got swept away in this, or if it was. It didn't seem like it was terrible that, and then that led to this. It seemed like she got swept up in something and sort of retroactively then told the story to herself about how miserable she was. But I don't know. He doesn't go into it. I think he really leaves that pretty ill-defined. He does not spend a lot of time talking about how unhappy she was before Vronsky happened.
Mm.
So I just thought it was kind of interesting.
Are any of the characters in the story villains? Like that we would describe as villains?
I think Vronsky's a villain.
Really?
Mhm.
He's just a charming young lad who.
No, no, I
He's
think
a shithead. He's a shithead.
I think
for sure.
I think he's a villain, and he's such a coward.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Although this goes to Tolstoy's ability to have compassion for his characters, is because by the end of the book, I don't want to say he redeemed himself. I don't think he redeemed himself, but you definitely felt his character in a compassionate. I did felt his character in a compassionate way. Kind of. I mean, I think he'd kind of seen the trap that he'd sprung for himself, and he also was unable to. So he was like fatalist. Like he was by the end, he just this sort of fatalist. Even before Anna died, killed herself, I think he still was like had fatalistically determined like this is how it's going to be because of what I did. So yeah, I mean he's definitely a hateful character, at least in the first half of the book. In the second half of the book, he kind of you see he's realizing it's dawning on him um, what had happened, but he can't and won't do anything.
Mm.
I did
I,
I did find it interesting that at one point that he is talking about like he's thinking about his code of ethics, or Tolstoy is describing that Vronsky has a code of ethics, but one of the codes of ethics was, and some of them are pretty good, but then one of them is like, well, if you want a woman, obviously you can have her, and the husbands, if you don't lie to somebody, but if it's the husband of a woman that you want, then you can lie or something. And I was like, okay, pretty shitty.
yeah,
So maybe I can agree with you, Gigi, that he was kind of a villain with a code of ethics.
yeah, I think he's the closest to a villain there is, but I think that speaks to Tolstoy's skill in depicting
Right.
characters. That even there, he like his virtues are believable. You understand
Yeah.
why people fell for him. Um,
Yeah.
and I love, one of my favorite things in art and literature is things where this it's already been spoiled, but it's still good.
Mm.
Like the movie Downfall, which is everybody's seen the scene with Hitler in the bunker that's been parodied a million times,
Right.
with Hitler reacting to the bad news and shouting at his generals, and you've seen it with a bunch of stupid subtitles for every different thing, and you see it in the context of the movie, and it is horrifying and spellbinding. Like no matter how many times you've seen it before, and it's just like it's such an incredible testament to the power of the art that even though this has been spoiled so many times over, it's still great. And I think about that all the time with, I think this book is such a great example of that. Like the spoiler, like, yeah, Anna kills herself at the end, and yet it's still just horrifying. Like that chapter is painful, just it is a psychological horror to read.
It was
Um,
disturbing to read. Like I was almost having to stop because I was just so disturbed by that mind.
well, and the other piece of it that, and to Vronsky's character, everything you need to know about Vronsky is told in one of the first chapters of the book with the steeplechase when he's racing the horse and he makes a stupid decision that gets his horse killed.
Hmm.
And everything you need to know about him is spelled out right there. He
Yes.
spoils the book right up front.
I was literally just thinking of that very thing, and I was going to say something similar. Absolutely. And that scene with the horse, oh, I could not bear to read that. I can't stand when any animals are getting her. It was a very terrible scene, but I thought the same thing, Evan. Like it revealed who he was as a person. Yeah.
Hmm. Nate, you said that Oblonsky was this vapid character, but I want to defend him in one sense because he was like the most similar to Vronsky, I think, in the book. A little bit better hearted, probably, but he's the one who held the dinner party that finally brought Kitty and Levin together. Um, and so, does that speak for the virtue of that kind of personality where, he's mostly a pleasure seeker, but he also just loves, kind of joyful occasions and people getting along with each other. And I'm wondering if, I mean, that's not a very deep character in the book, but is there something to be said, or is there some kind of lesson to be drawn? 'Cause I enjoyed the Oblonsky scenes. Even when what the beginning, the book starts with him where he's cheated on his wife, but there's a certain levity to his character that was a nice kind of contrast with the rest of the book. I felt like, even though it's superficial in many ways. I don't know what you guys think about that.
I didn't find him as intolerable as Vronsky. I mean,
Oh
he was
no.
shallow. He was shallow, but you could say that he was hospitable.
Yeah,
He had a lot of hospitality, and maybe he was a pleasure seeker. But I think like I felt like he had many more redeeming qualities. Um, and maybe he was shallow, but I don't think he was evil or bad. Even if he did do some things early in the book that were, not on the up and up.
What he did not have that Vronsky did have that I think made Vronsky who he was, and made Oblonsky basically not harmless, was ambition. He wasn't an ambitious person. Like that wasn't there, and I think it was that ambition, in Vronsky, that he had like to, that viewed on as a conquest essentially. That like that ambition was the thing that drove him, I think, into very bad territory. And I don't think that Oblonsky was like an awful person. He was just, like I said, vapid. He just was like an airhead. He was an airhead, is how I thought of him. And it made me wonder. Like I actually was wondering. I'm like, man, what was their family like? Like clearly, like there was a disconnect somewhere. Where, he and Anna, like there was like not a moral sense. They didn't have a moral sense. There was no moral, that was undeveloped somehow in their family, because he didn't have have that at all, and he was led pleasure seeker, and she followed her heart in this way that was not obviously didn't take her good places. So um he was good-hearted, affable, right? So he was kind of comic relief in a way, but like airhead was just the word I had for him. It's like this guy's air.
yeah. Hmm. Let's see. Anything else in the book? Maybe we can wrap up soon. But why should people care about this conversation? A lot of it's kind of like we're referencing specific characters and specific events. So if you haven't read the book, maybe not a lot of it's not making sense. But yeah, I don't know. Why are we discussing this book? What's the pitch for the audience that hasn't read it and we think should? I mean, maybe yeah.
Well, my pitch is almost from like a therapeutic perspective, it gives Tolstoy, like I said in the very beginning, he gives so much insight into the human condition, why we do the things we do, how we think about how we're feeling in those moments. And I just think that if you want to understand humanity better, if you want to relate to people better, if you want to have more intimate relationships with people, this book is, I think, almost essential, just because he does such a great job developing characters and their stories and really understanding who they are. I mean, for him to write that many characters so well, I'm just like, he's a genius when it comes to just knowing people. So from that perspective, if you just want to improve your understanding of humanity, I think read Tolstoy.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that. I mean, that is my that's always my my argument for reading fiction in general. So a, a, I went through probably a decade of my life pretty much reading no fiction after college, feeling like, oh, that's entertainment. That's not serious. I'm going to learn about the world. I'm going to learn things. That's more important. And at some point, I kind of rebelled against that and flipped kind of almost entirely. And it was kind of this realization that, you know, life's short. I'm not going to learn everything there is to learn about everything. It's not going to happen. So I need to prioritize. And what's more important than learning about how people relate to each other in this life? And fiction is the sandbox environment for human relationships. It's how we play around, put different people in a box and see how they play, see what happens. And it's the safe environment where we explore how people, how different kinds of personalities interact. And there's really no, you know, very few people. Nate probably has a much deeper insight than most of us because of, his work and getting to see lots of real world examples. But most of us don't actually see that many real world examples of that many different kinds of people interacting. Certainly not with the kind of depth that you get from a omniscient narrator reading people's thoughts. And so having that environment to explore is really invaluable. And I like I said, just a handful of others that I would say are kind of on a similar level as this, but this is about as good as it gets in terms of exploring those relationships in fiction.
Well, because I'm terrible at winding things down, I hope I don't open a can of worms here. But there was a part that as I'm thinking of wrapping it up, we didn't mention at all. Well, I mean, maybe in passing, but like the birth, you were talking about the whole life experience. He writes an incredible death scene and an incredible birth scene. Um, both of those, in both cases, Kitty is the star of the show. And throughout the book, and of course with Anna's thing, just the other thing that we haven't talked about quite as much is just his view of men and women and the complementarity of men and women and the different way, just the different sensibility and the complementarity of it. I thought was really came through in a lot of those scenes, and the appreciation of that, and how Levin learned very much to appreciate that, versus, like, for instance, Oblonsky, who did not appreciate that. Like it was like there was viewed as this divide, whereas like the Kitty and Levin marriage, it was a marriage because there was this complementarity between a very very complementary gendered experiences there that he really dove into a lot. So anyway, that's maybe a side note. It wasn't wrapping it up, so sorry.
Well,
um,
I mean, there's so many like little plot points that I just want to like mention just because they're interesting, but I don't actually have like a broader theme to connect it to. I just want to like maybe this is my way of wrapping up. Like the scene where they finally meet up, like in the middle of the book, Levin and Kitty, and the way that they fall in love was like writing, like not writing out words to each other, but just writing out the first letter. It was
Mhm.
like such like almost like a middle school, kind of scene. It's like it was
Yeah.
almost like the youth of their relationship, right? Um, and then there's the death scene with his brother, and she becomes kind of like this invaluable kind of helper through this process, and he didn't think she would be. And so you see this kind of maturation of their relationship. They have like they get home, they have like their squabbles, and then near the end, they've reached this kind of mature relationship where they kind of understand each other more. They've been through a lot together. So I just thought that was really beautiful. Um, there's one more thing that maybe I want to bring up, and I'm sorry if this opens up another can of worms, but the final scenes where Levin's having his religious conversion, and religion has been a big topic, I think, on a lot of people's minds lately. A lot of people have been having these conversions recently. There seems to be happening a lot lately. Um, myself, I used to be very religious, and I haven't been for a while, and I'm starting to get drawn in that direction again. Um, I'm curious, both you know Gigi and Evan as Christians, and then Nate. We're not really religious, at least right now. Like, how did you interpret that final scene? What did it like? How do you? Yeah.
In conclusion, let's talk about religion now.
Well, this is the final scene, so this is wrapping it up, right?
For me, it just feels like, and coming from the position of, obviously, like I'm coming from the position as a fellow believer with Tolstoy, so it feels like this is just the natural culmination for what he's put into this character all the way through. So, for me, like, maybe it feels too neat and too tidy, but I mean, I can understand how someone would see that, but at the same time, it's just like, no, this feels obvious. That this is something. One thing that I do think is interesting as a kind of contrast is the path that he takes to it is not the stereotypical one, I guess, in most modern American discourse. And I think it's something that, at least in my experience, is it's not the one that's described as often, but I think it is one that actually does happen, more commonly. That it's something that happens outside of your intellectualizing. It's something that happens outside of your plan and your thinking it through. And by the time it's done, you realize that it's already happened long ago and that you've been on this path for a while. And obviously, from the Christian perspective, like, we can explain that, and we have terms for explaining that. That's the Holy Spirit working in your life, creating faith in you, and that's how it happens. And but from the other perspective, yeah, it's like, this is something that develops outside of your intellectual approach to it.
But related to that, I found it very interesting that throughout the book, or especially later part of the book, he's spinning with these theological questions, especially near the end, and struggling and trying to over intellectualize it. And it was actually just one little statement from one of the peasants, and I forget what it was, that was just kind of this commonplace, like, oh, because he was wondering why, like, one kind of person was good, and one was very self-interested and selfish. And the peasant was something like, well, you're kind of like, it's because of faith, or it's because of his belief, and you're kind of like him. It was something like that. I don't remember, but it was just kind of off the cuff, and all of a sudden he has this like revelation, right? And it was like, from in terms of the status of society, one of a humble character, that suddenly, like, the intellectualization doesn't go away totally, but you know he realizes that you know what he was looking for is like imminence, I guess, and related to this idea of transcendent goodness that he recognizes in Christianity. And that he just needs to, like, I don't know, lean into it or something. I can't quite describe the theological nuance of those final scenes, but yeah, it was a very interesting scene.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I'm like I don't know, like a hair's breadth away from like being like I can see a Leo Tolstoy Windleberry Christian like that. The way, I mean, I resonate so much with the worldview conveyed in the works of those two that it's like that's, I mean, it's almost complete perfect resonance from, for me personally. Like, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, anyone have any last thoughts before we wrap it?
I did think, to like answer your initial wrap up question, like I think, the pitch for a doomer optimist style, doomer optimist type person is just that whether you're kind of coming at it from a tradition slash social decay point of view, or if you're coming at it from a landed ecological point of view, I think that the themes of this book are the themes that, in the conversation that happens in the deosphere that I'm aware of, like this hits them both squarely of like really right in the wheelhouse.
Can't agree more. That's a great way to end it. Thanks, y'all. Take care.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.